Greetings citizens of the world. With no seeming end to the grim Ministry of Defense, MOD, reports continuing to circulate in the Kremlin on a near-daily basis lately, a new one today states that the Bolivarian National Armed Forces, FANB, of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela have been placed on full alert status after 3 of America's B-1 strategic heavy bombers, assigned to the 7th Bomb Wing at Dyess Air Force Base, in Abilene, Texas, used the excuse of Hurricane Irma yesterday to depart from Naval Air Station Key West, in Florida, and who then entered into the restricted, protected airspace overseen by the Brazilian Air Force, FAB, and that occurred within 3 hours of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro declaring that his South American nation would no longer accept the US dollar as payment for its gas and oil. As to why the U.S. had stationed 3 of their most powerful B-1 nuclear-capable strategic bombers in Florida, this report notes, the Americans claimed was for their looking for drug smugglers, a fantasy explanation MOD experts deride, scoff at as being a feeble, inane excuse, as no first-world military power on Earth, such as the United States, would ever spend the nearly $60,000 an hour it costs to fly this nearly $300 million strategic nuclear bomber for such a simplistic aerial task, and that is, already, and for years, a mission done by the U.S. Navy's $36 million P-3 Orion maritime surveillance aircraft at a cost of $6,761 per hour. To the true, real mission of these B-1 strategic nuclear bombers, though, this report continues, MOD intelligence experts have determined as part of the ongoing large-scale military maneuvers being conducted by the United States to encircle Venezuela, whose code name is MSNBC, and is the largest multinational war exercise ever conducted in South America, English. Spearheaded by the U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, this report explains, MSNBC involves the United States and 16 of its allies, and whose military activities have been divided into 3 parts to include, 1. The 28th of August to 1st of September planning operation, 2. The 26-28 September logistics and military technology planning phase, and 3. The 6-13 November active operation phase occurring in Brazil's westernmost city on the Amazon River, Tabetena, where tens of thousands of these military forces will be able to invade Venezuela from Colombia. The United States' actions in South and Central America began to alarm the MOD, this report details, when under the Obama regime the Pentagon began a massive buildup of U.S. military bases there under the guise of their being used for drug interdiction purposes, but whose real, true purpose was revealed during the 2009 Honduran coup d'etat when the Americans overthrew that Central American nation's legitimately elected government. The crime for which the United States used to justify their overthrow the Honduran government, this report details, was due to its President Manuel Zelaya having sought to hold a non-binding, nationwide poll on whether to include a 4th ballot box in their 2009 elections to usher in a National Constituent Assembly for the rewriting of the country's constitution, and whose effort was intended to democratize the country's laws that favored the Honduran elite. Unlike in Honduras, though, this report notes, Venezuela was able to establish a National Constituent Assembly this past July, and that was followed, less than a fortnight later, by President Donald Trump sending shockwaves through Venezuela's political establishment when he announced that a military option is certainly something we could pursue to end the South American nation's crisis. The crisis referred to by President Trump in his threat to use military force against Venezuela, this report explains, was one wholly created by the United States and the European Union, whose Western banks have refused to extend any loans to that South American nation, causing what Finance Ministry official Konstantin Vyshkovsky calls a liquidity crisis but not a crisis of financial solvency. A liquidity crisis, this report explains, means that the 2 main sources of liquidity in the economy, banks and the commercial paper market, severely reduce the number of loans they make or stop making loans altogether, and because so many companies rely on these loans to meet their short-term obligations, this lack of lending has a ripple effect throughout the economy, causing a liquidity crisis at a plethora of individual companies, trying to meet payrolls, which in turn affects individuals who make runs on banks to feed themselves. The liquidity, as it pertains to the current crisis in Venezuela, this report further states, is the US dollar, that for decades has been used to purchase that nation's oil and gas, and who, also, have the largest proven reserves in the world of. With the United States and European Union choking off the supply of US dollars to Venezuela, therefore, this report continues, this nation's companies and peoples have been decimated due to their inability to find any of this international currency, and whose cost to buy is causing jaw-dropping hyperinflation, and that in its most simple explanation means that the cost of US dollars keeps rising by the hour. Not being understood by nearly all of the Western peoples, this report continues, is that oil-wealthy nations like Venezuela have been forced for decades to use the US dollar, called petrodollar, and it has allowed the United States to dictate to these nations anything they so desire, but that Venezuelan President Maduro, yesterday, stated that he would no longer put up with, and who declared, Venezuela is going to introduce a new international payment system and create a currency basket to get rid of the dollar peg. We, together with such freely convertible currencies as the yuan, yen, rupees, international currencies, will get rid of the clutches of the dollar that have been strangling our country. Rebelling against the US dollar as the international currency for buying oil and gas, however, this report grimly notes, puts a nation at grave risk of being destroyed by the United States, and as exampled by. In 2000, Iraq leader Saddam Hussein declaring his nation would no longer accept US dollars for payment for his nation's oil and gas, that was followed 3 years later, in 2003, by the United States breaching the UN Charter and illegally invading his country, and eventually executing him as an example too. In 2006, Syria announced it would no longer accept US dollars for its oil and gas, followed 6 years later by the United States creating the barbaric terror group ISIS to lay siege to that entire nation. In 2008, Iran ending all of its sales in oil and gas using US dollars, followed nearly immediately by the Obama regime placing devastating new sanctions on them. In 2011, Libya, Africa's largest oil producer, announcing that they would no longer sell their oil in US dollars, that was followed nearly immediately by the United States destroying that entire nation, and executing the nation's leader Muammar Gaddafi as another example. In 2017, Qatar turning its back on the US dollar, and that was swiftly followed by nearly all of the United States allies in the Middle East breaking diplomatic relations with them and threatening military action. And not least to be mentioned, Russia itself for its joining with China and Iran to break the diabolical stranglehold the US dollar has on the entire world, and who is now blamed by the United States for everything. Though sadistically labeled by the United States as their war on terror, and whose death toll is over 2 million and counting, this report says, this past July, 2017, both Russia and China declared all-out war against the US dollar, and whose actions support the dire words spoken, in 2006, by the late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez when he warned the world, if the US succeeds in consolidating its dominance, then humankind has no future. Therefore, we have to save humankind and put an end to the US. All too predictable too, this report concludes, the United States, like it has done against every other nation attempting to free itself from the satanic US dollar, is, likewise, now targeting the American people to fear Venezuela using the exact same propaganda they used against Iraq, Syria, Iran and Libya, and that includes the U.S. fake news media now openly calling for civil war in Venezuela. The United States downgrading all Venezuela banks to cause as much economic and social distress as possible. European diplomats interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs in order to divide peoples against one another. The globalist Black Pope of Rome calling for Venezuela's government to be overthrown. The U.S. puppet state of Colombia laughingly saying that Venezuelan troops crossed their border. And, as always, Venezuela may have nuclear weapons too.